Louis XIV, also called Louis the Great and known as the Sun King, was born on the 5th of September 1638 and ruled as King of France from 1643 until his death on the 1st of September 1715. His reign lasted 72 years and 110 days, the longest recorded for any monarch in history. He became the symbol of absolutism in Europe, and his legacy included the expansion of French colonial territories, the settlement of the 30 Years' War against the Habsburgs, and a dominant influence on the fine arts and architecture of France. Under his rule, the Palace of Versailles was transformed into a grand center of royal authority and political life. The magnificence and ceremony of his court defined the French Baroque style and promoted his image as the supreme ruler of early modern France. Louis began his personal rule in 1661 as chief minister. A firm believer in the divine right of kings, he pursued his father Louis XIII's policy of building a centralized state run from the capital. Determined to weaken feudal traditions, he compelled the nobility to live at Versailles, binding them to his authority and ending their independent power. Many of these nobles had taken part in the Fronde rebellions during his youth, and Louis's strategy effectively neutralized their threat. He created an absolute monarchy that lasted in France until the Revolution of 1789. Louis also insisted on religious unity under the Catholic Church. His revocation of the Edict of Nantes stripped Protestants of their rights, forcing them to emigrate or convert. This policy destroyed the French Huguenot community and reinforced Catholic dominance. Under his long reign, France became the leading power in Europe and was almost constantly at war. A struggle with Spain marked his childhood, and during his personal rule, he fought three great continental wars: the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. He also engaged in shorter conflicts, including the War of Devolution and the War of the Reunions. War was the driving force of his foreign policy, inspired by his quest for glory and power. He viewed diplomacy as an instrument to serve the military, teaching his envoys that their purpose was to secure advantages for France's armies. Yet these wars drained the kingdom's finances, leaving France heavily indebted by the time of his death in 1715, after the War of the Spanish Succession. He passed the throne to his great-grandson, Louis XV, along with a realm still powerful but exhausted from war. Louis XIV also left behind significant cultural and artistic achievements. He oversaw the construction of the Canal du Midi in southern France, stretching 240 kilometers, and supported some of the greatest names of French classicism. The playwrights Molière and Racine, the poet Boileau, the composer and dancer Lully, the painter Charles Le Brun, and the landscape architect André Le Nôtre all flourished under his patronage. Their works helped define the Grand Siècle, or the century of Louis XIV. He also founded the French Academy of Sciences, which advanced intellectual and scientific progress. Louis XIV was born on the 5th of September 1638 at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the son of King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria. He was given the name Louis Dieudonné, meaning Louis the God-given, and received the traditional title of heir to the French throne, the Dauphin. At the time of his birth, his parents had been married for 23 years, and his mother had endured 4 stillbirths between 1619 and 1631. For this reason, contemporaries regarded his birth as a divine gift and even a miracle. Louis shared an unusually close and affectionate relationship with his mother. Observers of the time noted that the queen devoted nearly all of her attention to her son. They both shared a love of food and theater, interests that Louis is thought to have developed through his bond with her. Their lasting connection can be seen in Louis's own writings, in which he reflected that, although nature had tied him to his mother by blood, the deeper bonds created by shared qualities of spirit were far stronger. It was Anne who instilled in him the belief in the absolute and divinely ordained authority of monarchy, which became central to his rule. As a child, Louis was placed under the care of governesses Françoise de Lansac and Marie-Catherine de Sénécé. In 1646, Nicolas V de Villeroy was appointed as his tutor. Louis formed a close friendship with Villeroy's children, especially François de Villeroy, and spent much of his youth dividing his time between the Palais Royal and the Hôtel de Villeroy nearby. In the spring of 1643, sensing that death was near, King Louis XIII arranged the future of his 4-year-old son, Louis XIV. Distrustful of his Spanish wife, Queen Anne, who under tradition would have served as sole regent, the king decreed that a regency council would govern in his son's name, with Anne at its head. Louis XIII died on the 14th of May, 1643, and only 4 days later, on the 18th of May, Queen Anne had his will annulled by the Parlement of Paris, a judicial body of nobles and senior clergy. This made her sole regent. She dismissed her late husband's ministers, Chavigny and Boutillier, and replaced them with the Count of Brienne as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Anne kept tight control of religious policy until Louis came of age in 1661. She also appointed Cardinal Mazarin as chief minister, entrusting him with daily administration. Although both Richelieu and Louis XIII had persecuted her and continued their centralizing policies to secure absolute authority for the crown and victory abroad for her son. To protect Mazarin, she exiled nobles who opposed him, including the Duke of Beaufort and her former ally Marie de Rohan. Anne's commitment to France was evident in her treatment of Chancellor Pierre Séguier, one of Richelieu's men. In 1637, Séguier had interrogated her harshly for secretly passing military information to Spain, her father's country, which left her nearly under house arrest for years. Despite her personal resentment, Anne retained him in office for the sake of France and her son. She pursued peace among Catholic powers, but only after ensuring French victory over Spain. This gave her foreign policy a Catholic character, which strained relations with Protestant allies, such as the Dutch, who negotiated a separate peace with Spain in 1648. That same year, Anne and Mazarin secured the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War. The treaty confirmed the autonomy of the many states of the Holy Roman Empire, granted Sweden new lands and seats on the imperial diet, and most importantly, gave France significant gains. Austria ceded its claims in Alsace and acknowledged French control over Metz, Verdun, and Toul. Many German states sought French protection to free themselves from Habsburg dominance, paving the way for the League of the Rhine in 1658. Yet just as France emerged stronger abroad, civil war erupted at home. The Fronde began in 1648, sparked by discontent over taxation, the expansion of royal power, and the reduced authority of the Parlement of Paris. Anne and Mazarin's attempts to tax members of the Parlement de Paris that year failed, and when they ordered old financial decrees destroyed, tensions rose. Buoyed by the military victory of Louis de Condé at the Battle of Lens, Anne pressed Mazarin to act decisively. They arrested leaders of the Parlement, including the influential Pierre Broussel, which provoked riots in Paris. Forced by the uprising, Anne released Broussel. In 1651, when Louis was 12, an angry mob broke into the royal palace, demanding to see their king. Led into his chamber, they found the boy pretending to sleep. Satisfied, they departed, but the threat drove Anne to flee Paris with her son. With the Peace of Westphalia concluded, Condé's army returned to support the court, and he initially aided Anne. The royal forces clashed with rebels led by Anne's old ally Marie de Rohan and François de Beaufort, who had escaped from prison. After several skirmishes, a compromise, the Peace of Rueil was reached, and the court re-entered Paris. But Condé soon turned against Anne, pushed by his sister, and allied with Rohan. Anne responded by arresting Condé, his brother, and their brother-in-law. This provoked a strong aristocratic coalition that freed the princes, forced Mazarin into exile, and placed Anne under virtual house arrest. Louis personally witnessed these chaotic years of the Fronde. He experienced flight from Paris, humiliating confinement, and violent uprisings. These events left him with a lifelong mistrust of Paris and the aristocracy, shaping his determination never to live in the old capital again. The First Fronde, led by the Parlement between 1648 and 1649, gave way to the Second, the Fronde of the Princes, from 1650 to 1653. This later rebellion was marked by intrigue and half-hearted warfare and brought together leading nobles of France, including Gaston, Duke of Orléans, his daughter Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans, known as La Grande Mademoiselle, Condé, Conti, the Duchess of Longueville, Beaufort, Turenne, and La Rochefoucauld. They opposed Mazarin's influence and sought to regain their lost political power. Anne, however, remained determined to secure absolute authority for her son. Most nobles distrusted Mazarin, who stayed in exile for several years, while the rebels claimed to be acting in Louis's name. Rumors spread that Anne and Mazarin were secretly married, with some believing Mazarin had become Louis's stepfather. The young king's coming of age and his formal assumption of power weakened the rebels' claims. The Fronde gradually collapsed, ending in 1653 with Mazarin's triumphant return from exile. During this period, Louis fell deeply in love with Mazarin's niece, Marie Mancini. But Anne and Mazarin opposed the match, sending her away to marry in Italy. While Mazarin may have considered marrying his niece to the king, Anne refused, determined to arrange a dynastic marriage with her brother, Philip IV of Spain's daughter. Mazarin eventually supported her view, recognizing that peace with Spain and the Spanish marriage were essential to securing both Anne's support for his power and France's future. This marriage would later prove decisive, not only in ending the war with Spain, but also in laying the foundation for Bourbon claims to the Spanish throne. Louis XIV was declared to have reached his majority on the 7th of September, 1651. When Cardinal Mazarin died in March 1661, Louis astonished his court by announcing that he would rule France himself without appointing a chief minister. He declared that until then, he had entrusted the government to the late cardinal, but from that moment forward, he alone would direct affairs. He ordered his secretaries and ministers to seek his personal approval for all decisions, forbidding them even from signing a passport without his command and requiring them to give him daily accounts. Taking advantage of the widespread desire for stability after years of civil war and foreign conflict, the young king consolidated central authority at the expense of the nobility. The historian Chateaubriand later praised his ability to select and encourage talented men, writing that the voice of genius could be heard from Louis's legacy. Louis began his personal reign by reforming administration and finances. In 1661, the treasury was close to bankruptcy, so he turned to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who became Comptroller General of Finances in 1665. But first, Louis had to eliminate Nicolas Fouquet, the ambitious superintendent of finances. Fouquet displayed his wealth and power ostentatiously, hosting the king at the luxurious chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte, and privately fortifying the island of Belle-Île, making him appear both corrupt and dangerous. Though his financial irregularities were no greater than those of his predecessors, his ambition alarmed the king. Fouquet was arrested, convicted of embezzlement, and sentenced to exile, but Louis personally changed the sentence to life imprisonment. With Fouquet removed, Colbert was free to reform the financial system. He reduced the taille, one of the main land taxes, and improved the efficiency of collection by requiring financial officials to keep stricter accounts and by auctioning off tax contracts rather than granting them privately to favorites. Before these reforms, barely 10% of revenue from the royal domain reached the treasury, but within a few years, the deficit of 1661 had been transformed into a surplus. Revenue from indirect taxation more than doubled, while royal domain income rose from 80,000 livres in 1661 to 5.5 million in 1671. By 1667, receipts exceeded expenditures, producing a surplus that strengthened the monarchy's position. These financial reforms provided the money to support a reorganized army, the magnificence of Versailles, and the expanding royal administration. Yet the French tax system remained deeply flawed. Only the lower classes bore the burden of direct taxation, while nobles and much of the bourgeoisie maintained exemptions. This inequity placed state expenses on the shoulders of the poor. Toward the end of his reign, encouraged by his devout second wife, Madame de Maintenon, Louis cautiously began to tax the nobility. Though concessions limited the impact, this marked the first time in French history that direct taxes were imposed on aristocrats, a step toward financial modernization and legal equality. Colbert and Louis also sought to expand French commerce. Following mercantilist principles, they created new industries, such as the Gobelins tapestry works and the Lyons silk industry, while encouraging foreign artisans, Italian glassmakers, Swedish ironworkers, and Dutch shipbuilders to bring their expertise to France. Their aim was to reduce imports, increase exports, and keep precious metals within the kingdom. Louis reformed the army with the help of Michel Le Tellier and his son François Michel, the Marquis de Louvois. They curbed the independence of the old military nobility and created a disciplined professional army. Senior command was no longer the privilege of a feudal aristocracy that quarreled over rank and ignored royal orders. Instead, Louvois emphasized discipline, organization, and even the welfare of the soldiers, ensuring loyalty to the king. Louis also undertook sweeping legal reforms. Before his reign, France was a patchwork of regional legal systems, with customary law in the north and Roman civil law in the south. The Great Ordinance on Civil Procedure of 1667, known as the Code Louis, imposed uniform rules throughout the kingdom. It required the registration of baptisms, marriages, and deaths by the state rather than the church, and curtailed the right of the Parlement to protest royal policy. This legal code later influenced the Napoleonic Code and, through it, many modern legal systems. In 1685, Louis issued the Code Noir, a decree regulating slavery in the colonies. While it sanctioned the institution, it attempted to restrict abuses, forbidding the separation of slave families and requiring that only Roman Catholics could own slaves, who in turn had to be baptized. Louis governed through a number of councils. The High Council dealt with the most important state matters and included the king, the Dauphin, the Controller General of Finances, and the Secretaries of State. The Council of Messages handled communications and reports from the provinces. The Council of Conscience directed religious affairs and episcopal appointments, while the Royal Council of Finances oversaw fiscal policy, one of the few councils that admitted members of the high aristocracy. The death of Louis XIV's maternal uncle, King Philip IV of Spain, in 1665 triggered the War of Devolution. In 1660, as part of the Treaty of the Pyrenees signed the previous year, Louis had married Philip's eldest daughter, Maria Theresa. The treaty stipulated that Maria Theresa would renounce all claims to Spanish lands for herself and her descendants, but this was made conditional on Spain paying a dowry of 500,000 écus. Since the dowry was never paid, Louis later argued that the renunciation was invalid, a claim that ultimately persuaded his cousin Charles II of Spain to leave his empire to Louis's grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, who became Philip V of Spain. Although the war was not directly about the dowry, the non-payment gave Louis the pretext to declare Maria Theresa's rights valid and to claim that the disputed territory of Brabant should devolve to her. In that region, children from first marriages retained inheritance rights even if their parent remarried, which meant Maria Theresa, as the daughter of Philip's first marriage, had a stronger claim than Charles II, his son by a later marriage. Using this reasoning, Louis launched his campaign against the Spanish Netherlands. During the 80 Years' War, France had supported the Dutch Republic against Spain, and Johan de Witt, the Dutch Grand Pensionary, considered French support crucial. But Louis's invasion of the Spanish Netherlands in 1667, known as the War of Devolution, threatened Dutch interests directly. The French captured Franche-Comté and much of the Spanish Netherlands, alarming the Dutch, who then formed the Triple Alliance with England and Sweden in 1668. This pressure, combined with a secret agreement with Emperor Leopold to divide parts of the Spanish inheritance, forced Louis to sign the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which made him give up much of his conquests. Louis, however, did not trust Leopold and soon saw that French and Dutch ambitions were irreconcilable. He decided first to crush the Dutch Republic before turning again to the Spanish Netherlands. To prepare, he bribed Sweden to remain neutral and concluded the secret Treaty of Dover with Charles II of England in 1670, creating an Anglo-French alliance. In 1672, France invaded the Republic, supported by Münster and Cologne. The rapid French advance caused a coup in the Netherlands, toppling De Witt and bringing William III of Orange to power. Emperor Leopold saw French expansion as a threat, especially after Louis seized Lorraine in 1670, and he allied with Brandenburg and later with the Dutch. Spain and the Duke of Lorraine soon joined the coalition against France. Although Charles II of England made peace with the Dutch in 1674, French armies, commanded by generals such as Turenne and Condé and Luxembourg, proved highly effective. Thanks to Louvois' reforms, they were better supplied, more disciplined, and able to begin campaigns earlier in the year than their enemies. Still, the French had to retreat from much of the Dutch Republic, which deeply disturbed Louis. Despite this setback, France maintained control of Alsace and the Spanish Netherlands and reconquered Franche-Comté. In 1678, exhaustion on both sides produced the Treaty of Nijmegen, which largely favored France. At this point, Louis was at the height of his power, but his aggression united Europe against him. Even after the war, he continued to press territorial claims through legal arguments rather than outright warfare, setting up the Chambers of Reunion to expand his borders under ambiguous treaty terms. This led to the annexation of Strasbourg and other territories in 1681. Spain declared war, beginning the War of the Reunions, but was quickly defeated. By the Truce of Ratisbonne in 1684, Spain was forced to recognize France's occupation of its conquest for 20 years. Yet Louis's expansionist policies damaged France's reputation. His bombardments of Algiers and Tripoli to secure treaties against Barbary pirates, followed by a devastating attack on Genoa in 1684, painted France as arrogant and brutal. Combined with harsh treatment of Protestants within France, European states grew wary and increasingly isolated France diplomatically by the late 1680s. Meanwhile, Louis expanded French influence overseas. French explorers pushed into North America. Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette discovered the Mississippi River in 1673, and in 1682, René Robert Cavelier de la Salle followed it to the Gulf of Mexico, claiming the vast Mississippi basin as Louisiane for France. French trading posts appeared in India at Chandernagore and Pondichéry, as well as in the Indian Ocean at Ile Bourbon. Across the colonies, French officials sought to replicate the architecture and urban design of Versailles to reflect the grandeur of the monarchy. Louis also established diplomatic relations with distant powers. In 1669, an Ottoman embassy arrived in France to renew the Franco-Ottoman alliance. In 1682, after receiving a Moroccan envoy, Sultan Moulay Ismail allowed French trading and consular bases in his territories. Another Moroccan mission followed in 1699, and in 1715, Louis welcomed a Persian embassy. Relations were also cultivated with Siam, whose King Narai sent embassies in 1684 and 1686, the latter led by Kosa Pan, and magnificently received at Versailles. In return, Louis sent envoys to Siam, and for a time French influence grew strong, until Narai's death and the anti-French revolt of 1688 ended this presence. France also attempted to expand its cultural influence in China. To challenge Portuguese dominance, Louis dispatched Jesuit missionaries to the Kangxi Emperor's court in 1685, including Jean de Fontenay and Joachim Bouvet. In 1684, Versailles welcomed a Chinese Jesuit, Michael Shen Futsung, and later Louis's library employed Arcadio Huang, a Chinese scholar and translator. These exchanges reflected Louis's ambition to extend French power and prestige far beyond Europe. By the early 1680s, Louis XIV had expanded French influence significantly, both at home and abroad. Within France, he consolidated the authority of the crown over both the church and the nobility, strengthening the system of absolute monarchy. At first, Louis supported the principles of Gallicanism, which limited papal power in France. In November 1681, he convened an assembly of the French clergy. 8 months later, the assembly adopted the Declaration of the Clergy of France, which increased royal power at the expense of papal authority. Bishops were forbidden to leave France without royal approval, and appeals to the Pope were restricted. Government officials could not be excommunicated for acts carried out in the name of their office, and papal decrees were invalid unless confirmed by the king. As expected, the Pope rejected this declaration, but it clearly enhanced Louis's power over the Church. At the same time, Louis achieved greater control over the aristocracy by binding them to his court at Versailles. The palace became not only a political hub, but also a social and cultural center, where nobles were drawn into a life of luxury, ritual, and constant attendance on the king. Historian Philip Mansell described Versailles as an irresistible combination of marriage market, employment agency, and the entertainment capital of aristocratic Europe. Apartments were built for courtiers, but the cost of maintaining a life worthy of their rank forced them into dependence on Louis, who granted pensions and privileges selectively. An elaborate daily routine placed the king at the center of attention, ensuring that loyalty and presence at court were rewarded, while absence could mean exclusion from royal favor. Through spectacle, distraction, and even surveillance, Louis tamed the nobility, transforming old military aristocrats into ceremonial courtiers while elevating newly ennobled bureaucrats into positions of authority. This strategy reflected his memories of the Fronde, when powerful nobles had turned against the monarchy. By reducing their independence, Louis ensured that France would avoid major civil wars for the next century. Under Louis's rule, France became the dominant power in Europe. Its population, central location, wealth, and professional army made it unmatched. Yet its financial system was inefficient and struggled to sustain the cost of repeated wars. During his reign, France fought 3 major conflicts: the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession, as well as 2 smaller ones, the War of Devolution and the War of the Reunions. War was central to Louis's vision of kingship, which he pursued with ambition, pride, and a desire for glory. He prepared tirelessly during peacetime for future campaigns and instructed his diplomats to secure strategic advantages for the military. By the mid-1690s, France had retained much of its dominance on land, but it had lost naval supremacy to England and the Dutch, and most of Europe, both Catholic and Protestant, had united against it. Vauban, France's foremost military strategist, advised Louis to rely more on privateering against enemy trade rather than confronting superior naval forces directly. One of the most controversial aspects of Louis's domestic policy was his religious intolerance. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes through the Edict of Fontainebleau. The Edict of Nantes, first issued by Henry IV in 1598, had granted Protestants political and religious freedoms. Louis saw its survival as a stain on royal authority and influenced by the prevailing belief that subjects should follow the religion of their ruler. He moved to eradicate Protestantism in France. He restricted Protestant assemblies, closed churches, prohibited mixed marriages, and rewarded converts to Catholicism. In 1681, he escalated his campaign by quartering dragoons in Protestant homes, a practice known as the dragonnades, which inflicted financial hardship and abuse. Facing such pressure, many Protestants converted, while others resisted. On the 15th of October, 1685, Louis issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, which revoked all previous protections. Protestant churches were to be destroyed, pastors were forced into exile or secular life, and those who resisted conversion were to be forcibly baptized into the Catholic faith. Historians have debated his motives. Some argue he sought to win papal favor, others that he hoped to regain prestige after Emperor Leopold's victories against the Turks, while others suggest he simply wanted to complete the process of religious unity in France. The results were devastating. Between 200,000 and 400,000 Protestants defied the ban on emigration and fled to Protestant states, taking with them valuable skills that enriched rival economies. Though many wealthy Protestant elites converted and remained in France, the exodus weakened parts of the economy and damaged France's international reputation. Catholic leaders in France supported the measure, but Pope Innocent XI criticized the violence, and Protestants across Europe were horrified. Louis's image as a powerful ruler was deeply tarnished in Protestant nations. Nevertheless, Louis's harsh policies reduced internal religious divisions, and his successor inherited a realm where religious unrest had been largely suppressed. By the late 18th century, attitudes had shifted, and the 1787 Edict of Versailles restored civil rights and freedom of worship to non-Catholics. 2 years later, with the French Revolution, Protestants gained full equality with Catholics. The 9 Years' War, fought from 1688 to 1697, marked the beginning of a decline in Louis XIV's political and diplomatic fortunes. The conflict arose from two succession disputes in the Rhineland. In 1685, the Elector Palatine Charles II died, leaving as his closest relative Louis's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Charlotte. German law largely excluded women from inheriting such lands and titles, but the rules were not entirely clear, and her supporters believed she had a valid claim. At the very least, she was entitled to a share of the family's personal property. Louis pressed her case, hoping that her claims would strengthen French influence in the region. Then, in 1688, Maximilian Henry of Bavaria, Archbishop of Cologne and a French ally, died. The natural successor from the Bavarian Wittelsbach family was Prince Joseph Clemens, but he was only 17 years old and not yet ordained. To secure the archbishopric for France, Louis attempted to place his own candidate, Wilhelm Egon von Fürstenberg, in the post, ensuring that Cologne would remain friendly to French interests. These moves, together with Louis's earlier expansionist policies, alarmed Europe. In 1686, the Holy Roman Emperor, Spain, Sweden, Saxony, and Bavaria created the League of Augsburg with the stated aim of forcing France back to the frontiers set at the Treaty of Nijmegen. Louis's fears were heightened by Emperor Leopold I's refusal to make the Truce of Ratisbon permanent, which suggested he was waiting to settle affairs in the Balkans before turning against France. The situation grew even more complicated with England's Glorious Revolution in 1688. When James II fled into exile after William of Orange invaded and claimed the English throne alongside his wife Mary II, England became a staunchly anti-French power. William's arrival transformed the League of Augsburg into the Grand Alliance. Before this, Louis had hoped William's invasion of England would keep him too occupied to intervene on the continent, so he launched preemptive operations in Germany. To deny his enemies supplies, French troops devastated large parts of southwestern Germany in what became known as the devastation of the Palatinate. Despite France's aggressive strategy, its armies, commanded by skilled generals like François-Henri de Montmorency-Bouteville, Duc de Luxembourg, achieved repeated battlefield victories. Luxembourg's triumphs at Fleurus in 1690, Steenkerke in 1692, and Landen in 1693 confirmed France's military strength, even if the victories rarely produced lasting strategic gains. France also succeeded in capturing Mons in 1691 and Namur in 1692 under Louis's direct supervision. Luxembourg's capture of Charleroi in 1693 strengthened French defenses along the Sambre. Further victories in Italy at Marsaglia and Stafford secured Savoy, while naval battles proved more inconclusive. Although the French fleet won at Beachy Head in 1690, it was defeated at Barfleur and La Hougue in 1692. France, nevertheless, enjoyed success overseas, raiding Cartagena in 1697 and securing immense wealth, though the Dutch captured Pondicherry in 1693. One of the most notorious episodes came in 1695, when Louis ordered the bombardment of Brussels to divert Allied attention from the siege of Namur. More than 4,000 buildings, including the city center, were destroyed, but the strategy failed, and Namur fell shortly afterward. The bombardment shocked Europe and damaged Louis's reputation, with Napoleon later calling it as barbarous as it was useless. Peace talks began intermittently from 1690 onward, but it was only in 1696, when Savoy switched sides after the Treaty of Turin, that momentum built toward a general settlement. The conflict ended with the Peace of Ryswick in 1697, which dissolved the Grand Alliance. France emerged with several gains: permanent sovereignty over Alsace, including Strasbourg, and recognition of the Rhine as its eastern border. Pondicherry and Acadia were restored to France, and French control of Saint-Domingue was acknowledged. However, France returned Catalonia and many of its recent conquests, and William and Mary were formally recognized as monarchs of England, Scotland, and Ireland. France also withdrew support for the exiled James II, while the Dutch secured the right to garrison fortresses in the Spanish Netherlands. Lorraine was returned to Duke Leopold, though France retained military access across it. Although Louis did not achieve all his goals, he secured significant territorial rights and prevented a complete defeat. Even as the war ended, attention in Europe turned to the looming question of the Spanish succession. King Charles II of Spain, frail and childless, ruled an immense empire spanning Spain, Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, and vast colonies overseas. The French claim to this inheritance came through Louis XIV's mother, Anne of Austria, and his wife, Maria Theresa. The Austrian Habsburgs, however, had their own claim through Archduke Charles, the son of Emperor Leopold I. To prevent either France or Austria from controlling Spain, England and the Dutch favored the Bavarian prince, Joseph Ferdinand. The Treaty of The Hague in 1698 attempted to partition the empire, giving Joseph Ferdinand the crown while dividing Italy between France and Austria. But Joseph Ferdinand's sudden death in 1699 upset this arrangement. A new Treaty of London proposed awarding Spain and its colonies to the Archduke while granting Italy to the French Dauphin, but Charles II resisted any partition. On his deathbed in 1700, he dramatically named Philip, Duke of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as his sole heir, provided Spain remained united. Louis accepted the will, making Philip V King of Spain, though this alarmed Europe. When Louis confirmed Philip's rights as a French prince and sent troops to secure the Spanish Netherlands, suspicion of a Franco-Spanish superpower intensified. Tensions worsened when Philip granted the lucrative asiento, the right to supply slaves to Spain's colonies, to France. Louis also recognized James Stuart, son of the exiled James II, as King of England after James's death, infuriating William III. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, beginning in 1702. The war opened with French victories, but the brilliant leadership of the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy soon turned the tide. At Blenheim in 1704, France's Bavarian allies were crushed, forcing Bavaria out of the war. The Allies then triumphed at Ramillies in 1706, capturing the Low Countries, and at Turin the same year, forcing French withdrawal from Italy. Later victories at Oudenarde in 1708 and Malplaquet in 1709 brought Allied forces close to France itself, though at Malplaquet the Allies suffered enormous losses. Meanwhile, famine, defeats, and financial strain weakened France. By 1709, Louis even offered peace terms that would have surrendered the Spanish crown to Archduke Charles and restored France to its older borders, but the Allies demanded that he himself force Philip to accept these terms by war, a condition Louis refused. France's fortunes revived with victories at Villaviciosa and Brihuega in 1710 and the decisive French victory at Denain in 1712. The wider political scene also shifted. Emperor Leopold had died in 1705, followed by his son Joseph I in 1711. The Spanish claimant, Archduke Charles, then inherited the Austrian throne, raising the threat of a vast Habsburg Empire reminiscent of Charles V. For Britain and the Dutch, this outcome was as unacceptable as a Franco-Spanish union. The change in circumstances paved the way for peace. The conflict concluded with the Peace of Utrecht in 1713 and the treaties of Rastatt and Baden in 1714. Philip V remained king of Spain and its colonies, but Austria gained the Spanish Netherlands and much of Italy. Britain secured Gibraltar, Minorca, Newfoundland, Rupert's Land, and Acadia, along with trading advantages. France retained Alsace and several smaller territories, while Louis abandoned his support for the Jacobite cause in Britain. The treaties preserved the European balance of power, but left France weakened and deeply in debt, even though Louis managed to secure a Bourbon dynasty on the Spanish throne. Louis XIV and his wife Maria Theresa of Spain, married in 1660, had 6 children together, but only their eldest son, Louis, known as the Grand Dauphin or Monseigneur, survived into adulthood. Maria Theresa died in 1683, and Louis famously remarked that she had never troubled him during their marriage except in dying. Although there was genuine affection early in their marriage, Louis was never faithful to Maria Theresa. He took a series of official and unofficial mistresses throughout his life. Among the best known were Louise de la Vallière, with whom he had 5 children between 1661 and 1667, Bondepont d'Audecourt in 1665, Catherine Charlotte de Gramont also in 1665, Françoise Athénaïs, Marquise de Montespan, with whom he had 7 children between 1667 and 1680, Anne de Rohan Chabot from 1669 to 1675, Claude de Vin des Oeillets, who bore him a child in 1676, Isabelle de Loudre between 1675 and 1678, and Marie-Angélique de Scoraille from 1679 until her death in childbirth in 1681 at the age of 19. Through these relationships, Louis fathered numerous illegitimate children, many of whom he married into cadet branches of the royal family to strengthen dynastic ties. His relationship with his second wife, Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon, proved more stable. He first encountered her when she was caring for his children by Madame de Montespan, particularly his favorite, Louis Auguste, Duke of Maine. Though at first put off by her strict piety, Louis grew closer to her due to the devotion she showed to his children. When he legitimized his children by Madame de Montespan in December 1673, Françoise d'Aubigné was appointed their governess at Saint-Germain. This position allowed her unusual freedom in speaking with the king, and she became one of the very few who could address him as an equal. It is widely believed that the two married secretly at Versailles either in October 1683 or January 1684. Though never formally announced, this union was an open secret at court and lasted until his death. Louis XIV was a devout Catholic who saw himself as the guardian of the Church in France. He made daily devotions no matter where he was and adhered to the liturgical calendar. Under the influence of his deeply religious second wife, his commitment to faith grew stronger, leading him to ban theatrical performances such as operas and comedies during Lent. By the later years of his reign, most of his religious observances were centered in the royal chapel at Versailles. His worship was marked by grandeur and splendor, from daily mass to the great ceremonies of Holy Week. He also founded the Paris Foreign Mission Society, though critics often highlighted the contradiction between his Catholic devotion and his pragmatic alliance with the Ottoman Empire, which many saw as undermining Christendom. Louis XIV was one of history's greatest royal patrons of the arts. He placed the Académie Française under his personal protection, becoming its protector, and supported some of the most celebrated writers of his age, including Molière, Racine, and La Fontaine. He sponsored painters like Charles Le Brun, Pierre Mignard, Antoine Coyse-Vaux, and Hyacinthe Rigaud, as well as composers such as Jean-Baptiste Lully, François Couperin, and Jacques Champion de Chambonnières. In 1661, he founded the Académie Royale de Danse, and in 1669, the Académie d'Opéra, which were milestones in the development of French ballet and opera. He also encouraged the work of André-Charles Boulle, who transformed furniture design with his innovative inlay techniques, later known as Boulle work. Always attentive to new talent, Louis even launched music competitions, one of which in 1683 brought Michel Richard de Lalande into royal service, where he composed monumental motets for the king's chapel. Louis's passion for the arts was matched by his architectural ambitions. Over 4 grand building campaigns, he transformed his father's hunting lodge into the magnificent Palace of Versailles. By 1682, the royal court officially moved there, turning Versailles into the dazzling center of power and diplomacy in Europe. Every ceremony, reception, and spectacle at Versailles revolved around the king, reinforcing his authority. The reasons behind Versailles have long been debated. Some, like the memoirist Saint-Simon, suggested that Louis built it as a self-contained power center, easier to control than Paris, where conspiracies could thrive. Others have argued that his dislike of Paris stemmed from the Fronde rebellions of his youth. Yet his investment in Parisian projects, such as creating a police force, installing street lighting, and founding the Hôtel des Invalides for injured and aging soldiers, shows that he did not neglect the capital. He also ordered the demolition of Paris's northern fortifications in 1670, replacing them with wide boulevards. Louis renovated other royal residences as well, including the Louvre. The famed Italian sculptor and architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini was at first invited to redesign the Louvre, but his plans would have destroyed much of the existing structure and turned it into an Italian villa. Instead, French architects Louis Levaux, Charles Lebrun, and Claude Perrault created the elegant Louvre colonnade that still stands today. Bernini did, however, leave behind a celebrated marble bust of Louis XIV, one of the most iconic portraits of the Sun King.